At 9:14 a.m., the phones inside the Ontario Energy Board began vibrating almost simultaneously. By 9:17, senior advisors inside Ottawa were no longer speaking in complete sentences. A deputy minister closed a red briefing folder halfway through a presentation and stared silently at the television mounted above the conference table. Across trading desks in New York, energy analysts started recalculating exposure to northeastern power imports from Canada before the segment had even finished airing, and somewhere between Washington and Toronto, 11 months of diplomatic stability collapsed in less than 4 words. Not a treaty, not a policy shift, just 4 words spoken live on camera that turned a political rivalry into a structural economic crisis before the morning coffee breaks had ended. The words themselves were simple. The meaning behind them was anything but. Donald Trump did not raise his voice when he said it live on television. That was what made the moment more unsettling. The sentence landed with the cold bluntness of a man who believed escalation itself was leverage. Cameras flashed. Reporters stopped typing. One Canadian diplomat seated near the rear of the room slowly removed his glasses and looked down at the table as though he already understood what the next 48 hours would look like. Then Mark Carney responded. 4 words calmly delivered across the same split screen. No shouting, no outrage, no dramatic pause, just 4 words that immediately transformed a personal confrontation into something far more dangerous, a structural economic threat that neither country could fully control once set in motion. Markets understood the implication immediately, because this was never really about insults. It was about leverage, and leverage in the modern global economy is often invisible until someone threatens to use it. Within 30 minutes of the exchange, futures markets were fluctuating across energy-sensitive sectors. Utility firms with northeastern grid exposure saw unusual pre-market trading activity. Television anchors were still replaying the confrontation as institutional investors quietly began asking a different question entirely. Not who won the argument, not who looked stronger on camera. The question that actually mattered was how dependent the United States had become on Canadian infrastructure without ever publicly acknowledging that dependency. That was the problem, not the insult, not even the retaliation. The problem was what the confrontation revealed about assumptions everyone had stopped questioning. For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada had been treated as automatic, predictable, permanent. Politicians argued publicly, while institutions maintained continuity privately. Supply chains deepened, energy corridors expanded, financial integration accelerated. The assumption underlying the entire architecture was simple. Neither side would ever seriously weaponize interdependence. But interdependence changes character during periods of political instability, especially when public humiliation becomes part of statecraft. Inside the White House, advisors reportedly believed Trump's confrontation would reinforce domestic political strength. Pressure was the strategy: dominate the room, control the headlines, force concessions through unpredictability. It was a negotiation model Trump had used for decades. Apply public pressure, create discomfort, escalate emotionally, force the opponent to react. But sovereign negotiations are not corporate boardrooms. Nations absorb pressure differently than businesses. Institutions move slower. Retaliation becomes layered. Consequences travel through markets before they appear in politics. And Mark Carney understood markets. That distinction would become critically important in the hours and days that followed. Long before entering Canadian politics, Carney had spent years inside the world of central banking, sovereign risk management, and institutional finance. He understood something many political operators often underestimate. Markets are not emotional, but they are deeply sensitive to instability. Economic systems run on confidence, and confidence is fragile. The visual contrast between the two leaders became impossible to ignore after the broadcast. Trump leaned forward aggressively during exchanges, speaking over moderators, interrupting responses, turning diplomatic friction into spectacle. Carney sat almost motionless, hands folded, expression controlled, speaking in measured sentences that sounded less like political rhetoric and more like institutional warning signals. One side appeared focused on dominance. The other appeared focused on systems, and systems tend to outlive moments. By midday, officials inside the United States Department of Energy were reportedly requesting updated assessments regarding Canadian electricity dependencies across Michigan, New York, Minnesota, and parts of New England. The numbers were uncomfortable. The United States was not broadly dependent on Canadian electricity nationwide, but certain regional grids were deeply interconnected. Ontario and Quebec supplied substantial cross-border electricity, during periods of peak demand in states already facing infrastructure strain, seasonal volatility, and aging grid architecture. Disruption risks were no longer theoretical. The issue was not whether Canada could permanently shut off power to the United States. The issue was whether markets believed the threat itself had become politically imaginable. That alone was enough. Power markets hate uncertainty. Bond markets punish unpredictability. And allies become nervous when major economies begin threatening each other's infrastructure. But the real damage had not yet begun, because energy was only the surface layer of a much larger geopolitical recalibration already underway behind closed doors. In Brussels, European trade officials reportedly began circulating internal assessments regarding North American strategic fragmentation. German manufacturing analysts warned privately that escalating United States-Canada tensions could further destabilize already weakened transatlantic supply chain coordination. Japanese investment firms sought clarification from Canadian ministries regarding long-term energy export reliability. It sounded absurd at first, until executives started doing the math. Canada was not merely a neighboring country, it was one of the United States' largest trading partners, critical energy supplier, rare earth provider, defense collaborator, and financial counterpart. Every year, more than $900 billion in bilateral trade moved across the border. Integrated automotive manufacturing alone depended on parts crossing the frontier multiple times before final assembly. The Ambassador Bridge between Windsor and Detroit carried roughly 25% of all merchandise trade between the two countries. One bridge, one artery, one structural vulnerability. And suddenly people were talking openly about leverage. That was the moment officials realized the crisis was becoming irreversible. Not because electricity would actually be shut off indefinitely, but because the psychological boundary had been crossed, the unspoken rules had changed. Institutional trust takes decades to build and minutes to damage. Inside Toronto's financial district, executives from major pension funds and sovereign investment offices reportedly held emergency discussions regarding retaliatory tariff scenarios and North American political risk exposure. Currency strategists began discussing governance instability premiums, normally associated with emerging market political disputes rather than G7 allies. That was extraordinary. The United States and Canada were supposed to represent the stable core of the Western economic order. Now investors were discussing retaliatory escalation pathways between them, calmly, professionally, like risk managers preparing for storms they never expected to see. Meanwhile, television audiences focused on the spectacle, the insult, the clip, the viral moment. But experienced diplomats understood something else was happening beneath the surface. Public confrontations between allied leaders rarely remain confined to personalities. They expose deeper fractures already developing inside institutions. And this fracture had been growing quietly for years. Trade disputes, tariffs on steel and aluminum, defense spending tensions, industrial subsidies, electric vehicle supply chain competition, energy nationalism, strategic mineral competition. The televised confrontation merely forced those tensions into the open. What happened next changed the negotiation permanently. At 2:43 p.m., an energy market strategist appearing on a major financial network described the exchange as a credibility shock to North American integration assumptions. The phrase sounded technical, almost boring. It was neither, because credibility is the foundation of modern economic power. Countries borrow against it. Markets price assets around it. Alliances depend on it. And when credibility weakens, the effects spread quietly at first. Then suddenly, within days, institutional investors began asking whether North America was entering a new phase of economic nationalism, driven less by strategy and more by political volatility. The distinction mattered enormously. Markets can survive conflict. They rarely survive unpredictability. Carney's response